So with static properties out of the way, let's come back to inheritance and to a concept related to that. Another way of adding methods to classes which you plan to inherit from. Here's our department class, and as you know, we're inheriting from it on the IT department and the accounting department. Now we do have that describe method here in our department class, and therefore we can call this on any instance based on IT department and accounting department because these classes are based on department and they have access to all the properties and methods of that department base class. Now, as you learned, you can override methods. So for example, here in accounting department, we could add our own describe method version where I want to do something different, where I maybe want to say accounting department ID and then access this.id. Now this would not work here because ID is a private property of department, and therefore we need to turn this into a protected one so that it's available in classes based on this class as well. But with that, it should work. And if I now call describe on accounting, which we can do, of course, let's maybe comment out these two lines and instead call accounting.describe down there, we should see that new output. And indeed, we see accounting department ID D2. Now, of course, we could also override the describe method in the IT department. But sometimes you don't just want to offer the option of overriding a method, because that always exists. You instead want to force the developers working with a certain class or extending a certain class to implement a certain method or to override a certain method. When would you do that? Well, whenever you want to ensure that a certain method is available in all classes based on some base class, in this case department, but when you also know at the same time that the exact implementation will depend on the specific version. So when you can't provide a general method, but you want to enforce that this method exists, but the inheriting classes will need to provide their own implementation because you can't provide a default implementation in the base class. So in such a situation, you might want to have an empty method in your base class and now force all classes based on that class to add and override this method. And you can do so by adding the abstract keyword here. If you add abstract here, you see we get an error that this is only available in an abstract class. So if you have one method or more with abstract in front of the method, you have to add abstract here in front of class as well. And now we're good regarding that. But now you see I have an error here. Describe cannot have an implementation because it is marked as abstract. You have to remove the curly braces, add a semicolon, and instead add the return type this should have. In this case, void. So now you're just defining how this method should look like, what its structure is, but you're not saying anything else besides this. Now, however, we get an error in the IT department because it does not implement the inherited abstract member describe, which means we don't offer the describe method here. And we do have to do that because we're based on the department class, which is abstract and which has such an abstract method, which means this method has to be implemented by any class based on this department class. So now here in IT department, we have to add a describe method. And in there, we can now console log IT department and then do whatever we want. This can be the same implementation as we have it in the accounting department, but it can also be a different one. So now with that, we can save this and it recompiles and we get the almost same output as before, but now we have the different implementations of the describe method in our different classes based on department. Abstract can therefore be very useful if you wanna enforce that all classes based on some other class share some common method or property. You can also have abstract properties. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you don't have to provide the concrete value, the concrete implementation in the base class, but instead the inheriting class has to do that. Also important, abstract classes, so classes marked as abstract with this keyword, can't be instantiated themselves. So you can't instantiate department now. It's basically just a class that's there to be inherited from so that the inheriting classes can be instantiated and the inheriting classes are forced to provide concrete implementations for, in this case, the describe method following the structure you laid out here. So with the this keyword referring to a department instance or an instance somehow based on department, including inherited classes that might be in between, and that it doesn't return anything.